Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here, both in person and online. I'm Sana Siddiqui, Program Manager for the Institute of Arctic Studies. I'm profoundly lucky that I have the role of managing student experiential opportunities and learning in Arctic and polar spaces. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon for a talk by Dr. Kerim Nisancioglu, hosted by Dartmouth's Institute of Arctic Studies and the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. The Institute of Arctic Studies, established here at Dartmouth in 1989, works to serve Dartmouth's hub for a diversity of multidisciplinary Arctic activities, education, scholarship, and global policy dialogues. In all of its work, the Institute also endeavors to center the voices of Arctic indigenous peoples, those for whom the Arctic is their home, as it has been for thousands of years, in both studies of and solutions to our shared Arctic and global challenges. With that, let me say that the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies, Dr. Melody Berkens, is truly sorry that she could not be here this evening. She wanted me to relay how much she enjoyed speaking with Kerim over the past few weeks, as they both discovered so many shared interests across Arctic scholarship and policy. I also have had the pleasure of having delightful conversations with Kerim about how we can collaborate on student programming. And we've actually had a line of students eager to meet and have a conversation with him about potential opportunities. Dr. Berkens is already planning to follow up on conversations with you, Kerim, in hopes that Dartmouth and Bergen might continue connecting to advance our shared interest and commitment to more ethical, meaningful, impactful engagement with Arctic communities. Without further ado, let me now introduce our distinguished speaker. Dr. Kerim Nisancioglu is a professor of climate dynamics at the University of Bergen in Norway and the Bjerknes Center for Climate Research. He also holds a Professor II position at the Department of Geosciences and the Center for Earth Evolution and Dynamics at the University of Oslo. Currently a Fulbright Distinguished Scholar and visiting professor at Scripps Institute of Oceanography, his interdisciplinary research focuses on understanding the dynamics of climate change across various timescales. He does this by employing a combination of climate and ice sheet models to better understand the complexities of past and present climate systems, a focus of many of our scholars here at Dartmouth as well. Throughout his career, he has led and participated in numerous significant research projects, advancing our knowledge of the Arctic and of global climate dynamics. One of these projects included time spent as a principal investigator for the European Research Council Synergy Grant Project Ice to Ice, that investigated the effects of Arctic sea ice loss on the Greenland ice sheet. He is also dedicated to science education and outreach, once creating a 3-week hands-on experiential education course across the Stressfjord Lemkul. Did I get that right? It's a 100-year-old 3-masted sailing ship for the One Ocean Expedition Project, work that both educated and inspired students to protect our global oceans. He is also engaged in public governance, having served as an elected member of the City Parliament of Bergen for a committee tasked with the city planning, climate, and environment. Connecting all his work in climate dynamics, education, and community engagement, Kerim currently serves as the project leader for the Climate Narratives Initiative, an interdisciplinary project funded by the Research Council of Norway that explores climate stories from Greenland to Fiji. As part of this project, he has worked with the University of Bergen and representatives from several Greenlandic communities to co-create the Illu Science and Art Hub in Ilulissat, Greenland, a unique community-engaged climate education and outreach program that I'm sure you will hear about more during his talk tonight, and we've had conversations about potential opportunities today. With that, we are truly honored to have Kerim here at Dartmouth to tell us more about his work in Greenland with his talk, Greenland's Glaciers, Bridging Science and Local Knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kerim Nisancioglu.
Yes, can you hear me? So thanks, that was quite an introduction. I was like, wow. Yeah, I'm Kerim Nisancioglu. I'm a professor at the University of Bergen. I can tell you a little bit myself, and then normally I would ask you where this is, but I think Sana already kind of told you. But anybody know where this is? And you can't say Greenland. What did you say? Ilulissat, yeah, obviously, and I recognize the person here. But if you haven't been there, I truly and really encourage you to visit, especially Ilulissat, but Greenland in general. It's a beautiful place. For me, as a Norwegian, visiting Greenland is coming to a Norwegian fjord full with ice and a culture that's rich with history and generational knowledge that has been incredibly important in everything I've done in the past many years in relation to science in Greenland. This is work that's been done over some years with lots of people, including actually Helen Sarusi. I don't see her in the room. Maybe she's online, but we'll be meeting later. She's coming. Okay, great. Helen will know most of what I'm going to talk about. So this is also a work with a PhD that I shared with her some years back, Karita Kayanto, as well as other PhDs in this project, Linda and Iliana in particular, and colleagues in Ilulissat. Kangiata Ilursua is the Icefjord Center, which is the visitor center in Ilulissat, and Navanata is the local municipality. And this is work that's been done in collaboration and inspired by them over the couple of years, which has been going. And so just to show you, I'm Norwegian, I'm half Turkish, so my name is Kerim Nisancioglu is Turkish. I've worked in this place for many years now. It's called the Bjerknes Center for Climate Research. It's about, I think, I can't remember how many we are now. I think we're about 400 scientists. Many of them, if not all of them, relate to the polar regions, in particular the Arctic. There are also quite a few working with the Antarctic. It's also the place where modern meteorology was discovered, due to Wilhelm and Jakob Bjerknes. That's partly why the logo is as it is. It's a frontal system. So this has a long history of both oceanography and meteorology, and it's a beautiful place. If you haven't been to Bergen, Norway, I truly recommend it as well. I'm not from there. I'm from further north in Norway, so I'm not too biased. This is Bergen. I'm going to talk about Greenland. These are now colored here, just the Nordic countries for perspective. I'm happy to answer questions about anything in general, also about the region, but I think we're going to stick to Greenland in terms of science, and given the politics of today, I think this is even more relevant, and also to understand the people of Greenland is important. This is me, and I was allowed to introduce my son, who's in the audience. You can try to guess. We live up the hill from the old wharf, Hanseatic wharf of Bergen. It's about a 1,000-year-old city with a lot of history in stockfish trading to many parts of the world. Our house is, well, we're trying to be energetically self-sufficient. That's another story of my life as a politician, as a house owner with my wife, Susie. But much of my time I use, as many of you, in science and in education and in outreach. And one of the programs that I just want to point out for those who might end up pursuing a grad program later is the ACDC Summer Schools. It's advanced climate dynamics courses. They are general courses in climate dynamics that we run every year. And it's a collaboration with the University of Washington. And it's a hands-on field program in the summer where we go out, we do collect data and work on projects, as well as work in groups, intense program over about 2 weeks, every year. This year we're going to the forests of northern Sweden. We've been to Greenland, we've been to Iceland, we've been to Newfoundland, we've been to many different places. So we like to go where there's a current important topic that also relates to the place we are. This is the one that Sanna mentioned. We also do now, the last 2 years, a course on board the Statsråd Lemkull, or actually started 3 years ago now. This is a very different type of course. We were challenged by the foundation that runs this ship out of Bergen. It's a 110-year-old school ship used by the Navy for training. And it's now kitted out as a fully fledged research vessel with all the state-of-the-art instruments for atmosphere and ocean monitoring. But we use it for training with students, and we're going from the Azores to Nuuk in July. Unfortunately, you can't apply now. It's already full, oversubscribed by a lot. But it's something that we will do many times. And in here, we're also having Greenlandic students on board, as well as Norwegian and US and international students. And a big part of this is to have an exchange of understanding and cultures in addition to the scientific activities on board. All right, so now we'll come to the science. So this is kind of the typical scientist in me, working in the Arctic, very distant from any culture, any people, any indigenous community. This is on top of the Greenland ice sheet, about 3,000 meters above sea level in the far northern part of Greenland. It's on the East Grip ice core site, which has been now just packed up this last summer. We completed the ice core of almost 3,000 meters. That tells us quite a lot about the history of the Greenland ice sheet and the history of climate, in particular this area, which is a very fast-moving part of the Greenland ice sheet, and I'll come back to that. This is the first time anybody has drilled an ice sheet into a fast-flowing ice stream. It's almost like a river of ice. The reason I bring up this picture is because I felt working over the years as a helicopter scientist or as a seagull flying into Greenland and going home again with the data, I didn't really contribute to the local community. I didn't get to integrate and understand properly the culture and the people and their perceptions of climate and environmental change and societal change through the years I've been there. Close to 15 years now, or even more than 15 years. So I've switched to something very different from working underneath the ice with a bunch of international colleagues, and it's of course important and extremely valuable work, but it's a different type of work than what I'm going to talk about today. This is within the ice sheet, about 7 meters below the surface, where it's minus 26 all summer, and I spend about a month there every year in this cold freezer, so it's my summer holiday. Now comes the one of the key things that I want to talk about in addition to the ice sheet and the glaciers is the people of Kalaallit Nunaat, or Greenland. So this is Søren, who was a close collaborator friend. He was actually a crew, a fisherman also on one of the research ships on Western Greenland. He passed away a few years ago. But I learned a lot, not only from him, but from many others. And I'll come back to this and give you a few of the stories, right? Some of the stories that I've been told that have shaped and directed our science over the last 10 years. So before that, though, I want to just give an introduction, this general audience, right, to Arctic climate change and set the stage before we go zoom into the specific fjord and the people living there and the impacts of climate change on the communities. And most of you will have seen this, maybe not this graph, but this is the Norwegian Earth System model. Of course, we use the one that we're more engaged with. It's one of these IPCC class general circulation models that shows the historical changes in temperature on the surface of the Earth as an anomaly, so a difference over the past 150 years. And you can see there's a lot of variability. It's colder, warmer. But in general, when you get to the 2000s or 1990s, the temperatures are increasing. And when you get to today's situation, we're almost a degree warmer than it was in the pre-industrial era, right? So the last 50 years has seen an increase in temperature, and in particular, you'll notice that that's in the Arctic. Not only, and there are other areas where there's a cooling. Now, the question and the challenge for all of us in this science is what's happening in the future. We know to a large extent how CO2 impacts climate, but there's a lot of variability, there's a lot of feedbacks, so it's complicated. But if you look at these two scenarios, there's the pessimistic, sort of what's known as business as usual, not realistic anymore, with up to 5 degree warming, and then you have the more optimistic, closer to 2 degree warming, and maybe even a bit less, which is, I think, at this point, we're somewhere in between, maybe closer to the optimistic than the pessimistic. But if you look at this very extreme scenario, you'll see that the Arctic is more than 10 degrees warmer, right, by the end of this century. Whereas in the more optimistic, closer to reality case, still we'll be warmer than this. We'll still have a warming of several degrees in the Arctic. And you can see, again, all the changes are larger in the Arctic regions. And there are also big impacts in terms of sea ice. This shows you the rate of change. It's a bit more complicated figure, but it shows you the rate of change in temperature and the rate of change in sea ice over the observed period. So these are observations. It's air interim for those who are interested in the Arctic. And what you can see here in the red, that is this region in the parts of the Arctic towards Russia has the largest and fastest changes in temperature, and it also goes hand in hand with the largest and fastest changes in sea ice. That makes sense, right? I mean, those two go quite close and are closely related. You also see that this impacts not only the ocean, but also the land. But the biggest changes are in this region, and you might have heard about Svalbard or Spitsbergen. This is where you have huge changes in temperature over the past years, especially in the winter. This is the situation that we're going into, right? The new norm, and you're not far away from having an ice-free Arctic in the summers, and it's not many years until you get there. This is the 2024 minimum sea ice, so last year, and you can see the yellow is sort of the average, what you might think or would expect without a strong an increase in global temperatures. So the Arctic is warming, and you're getting this situation where you can actually have shipping from Norway to Japan. We can export our natural gas to Japan, or you can have shipping from China to Europe and so forth, right? This is what's the new norm. And you have cruise tourists going into the Arctic, mineral exploration and whatnot. So the whole situation is changing dramatically. And as is also the situation for Greenland, which we'll come back to. So this is the Greenland ice sheet. You think it's just a big block of ice. This is this beautiful NASA animation that some of you have seen before, I hope. But in reality, there's a lot of movement, right? And you have this strong flow of ice into the fjords at the coast of the ice sheet. This is the Northeast Greenland ice stream. This is where we drilled the ice core over the last 5, 6, 7 years. It transports big masses of ice, more than close to 15% of the total mass of the ice sheet is funneled through these fjords in the northeast, and there are many others that are not as large. And then you get to the west coast in Ilulissat or Disko Bay and Sermeq Kujalleq, which is the glacier I'm going to zoom in on at the bottom of this figure, or on the central part here. You can see this is Sermeq Kujalleq. This is one of the fastest flowing glaciers in Greenland and contributes more than 10% of the total mass loss of ice from Greenland. So it's a major player in global sea level. I'm not going to talk about Fiji, but if you think about what happens when the Greenland ice sheet melts, well, you contribute water, you contribute ice, and eventually melts, and you get the sea level rise globally. Along the coast of Greenland, sea level is dropping, and that's because you're unloading big masses of ice and the land is rising. So that's, of course, an issue, very different from what we're thinking about in terms of sea level, because you have sea level drop for infrastructure and for stability of fjord walls and things. This is important, of course, but the major impacts of Greenland melting are in the tropics, and thereby also this link to, for example, the small island states, including Fiji and all the other islands that are struggling now because of rising sea level and the big impacts of storm floods when you have hurricanes and storms coming through. Okay, but I'm going to talk about Greenland, but it's, of course, the context of global sea level, which is important for the community, other places in the world, and people living along the coast. This is a zoom in of Disko Bay, and this is the town of Ilulissat and the fjord of Ilulissat-Kangya, or the ice fjord. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's one of the places now with the most tourists in Greenland, also the most scientists. The mayor, Palle, told me that he counted 1,000 scientists in Ilulissat last year. And there were almost, well, it wasn't 100, but 75 cruise ships. So and there are about 5,000 people living there. So it's the third largest city in Greenland. It's not a small city. There are about 56,000 people living in Greenland. But it's one of the most spectacular places also. So there's no wonder people want to come there. For us scientists, it's important, and it has been important over many years because of this glacier that you can see here coming out. It's called Sermeq Kujalleq. And if you look back in history, this is also the most important fishing and hunting grounds for the native population, including also the Norsemen, the Vikings, when they came about 1,000 years ago. There were already Inuit here, but they were trading and fishing and hunting as well. And this has been, and still is, the major revenue from Greenland. It's about 95% of the economy is based on fishing, and this is the major hub. And there are about 400 small fishing boats in Ilulissat, also larger trawlers that are more offshore for shrimp. But in the local Disko Bay, it's the smaller fishing vessels, as well as in the Ilulissat ice fjord. The one reason, I want to say it already now, this is such a productive area, one of the major reasons is this glacier because under the glacier, on the surface of the glacier when it melts, most of the water goes into the crevices and the moulins, if you heard about moulins. So they find the water, finds its way to the bottom of the ice sheet and comes out as a subglacial flow or as a flow beneath the glacier into the fjord and creates upwelling. So you get a lot of nutrients, you get a lot of food for the fish and for the wildlife in the fjord along this type of glacial margins. And in particular, this area, it's known that the halibut are much larger. It's not just known. This is very clear from the fishing there for generations. They're very large and very plentiful halibut in this fjord. And so it's a race to get in there, both in the winter and in the summer. All right, so a bit more science. So this is the historical retreat of this glacier, and you can see that it has retreated in periods since, well, even before this, but this is the Little Ice Age, so this is sort of the maximum situation when it was cold 150 years ago, and then it's retreated and sometimes here quite rapidly and shedded large pieces of ice into the fjord. I forgot to mention also, this is where the Titanic iceberg came from. This is the large type tabular icebergs, if you can call them that, from Greenland. They're not as large anymore, and that's because once you get into this region here, the fjord is narrower and shallower, so the ice front is more stable, and you have smaller icebergs. You might have more icebergs, but you have smaller icebergs. And this is something that not only our models tell us or predict or expect, but you also hear it in what people are saying. One person I talked a lot here is Bodil, who was the grandmother of one of our friends who actually worked with us for some years now. And she'll describe this, how the icebergs were this tall standing from her balcony in this fjord. Well, she lives in Ilulissat, whereas now they're much smaller. The other thing that Bodil will tell me, and you might have heard this before, it's much more humid, or it feels colder in the Ilulissat, and it's harder to dry, for example, sealskin or other fabric they use for their traditional clothing, right? So that's, for a scientist like us, well, if you have more open water, which we know there's less sea ice also in this region, in Disko Bay and Ilulissat, well, it's more humid. And this is something that everybody's very aware of. And then the question is, how is it going to develop and how is it going to affect the local communities? All right, so what's happening in Ilulissat? And this is just a very simple schematic, but it is based on a model. Part of this is done, and I already introduced Helen. I think I see you. There you are. That work done by Karita Kayanto, who was a PhD with us some years ago. What happened is, you saw already that it was a retreat of the glacier front over the last several decades, and it stabilized because there's a shallow and fairly narrow part of the fjord. But the question is, when it gets thin enough, when will it retreat further? And if it does retreat, which we expect, it will retreat rapidly into this deeper part of the fjord. This is what often has been referred to as the tipping point. I'm very careful with using that word, and there's a lot of discussion of this in the media, but if anything, to me, in Greenland, in terms of a tipping point, this is one example. Because if you melt the glacier sufficiently in the next decades, it's going to retreat rapidly. And you need the persistent period of cold climate, as cold as the Little Ice Age, maybe thousands of years, to be able to advance the glacier back out the fjord. So it's in reality, in practice, an irreversible change, a rapid irreversible change. And I would say that is a tipping point in terms of this glacier. You can't really stop something which we know will happen in the coming years. And the question is, of course, for us as scientists, how much will that contribute in terms of ice loss and thereby sea level? That's a big question, and it's hard to give a good answer, but there's a big community working on this. All right, so now a little bit more about the fjord. This is what it looks like most of the year, especially in the summer. Lots of icebergs. This is what they call ice melange. This is just from it was last year. I was there a month ago, but it didn't look quite the same. Actually, a month ago, you could sail, and I sailed with one of my colleagues all the way in here and into this region. It was more than a couple of kilometers of open water here, and that often happens now in February, March. There's not as much melting, not as much calving, and it's more stable, the ice pack. So there's some periods now in the early, or not early spring, but late winter, where there's open water there. And we went in there with about 10 other boats because they're all racing in there to get into the halibut. So if you go in December or November, December, January, February, Then they're out on the sea ice in this region while it's stable and safe. This is not safe. This is the summer. And they fish by dog sleds. So you drive your snowmobile about 20 kilometers in the fjord, on land though, along the fjord, and then you get off your snowmobile onto the dog sleds, and then you go out into this region where it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So you're not allowed to use your snowmobile, and then you can fish there, and they stay there for many weeks, up to months, and fish. The challenge was that last year it cold because they had to evacuate early. Turned out there was a lot of small icebergs embedded in the sea ice. So, and when you have a lot of icebergs embedded in sea ice, it's less stable. So they actually had to leave this early, about 2 months early, which was a challenge because it's such an important part of their income for some of these who don't have a fishing boat, or you don't need much more than dogs and a sled to be able to do this. So that was actually quite critical for some of the people who depend on this. And this year they're out there now. I haven't heard that they had to leave early, so that's a good sign, I guess. But of course, one of the questions then is like, how will the sea ice condition and the iceberg condition change in the coming years? Do I have to give up fishing from the sea ice by snowmobile and dog sleds, and go by boat out into the bay or into the fjord, which is much more dangerous, and a smaller season? It's only a few months you can go in there. Well, it's never safe, but we're at least very, very uncertain when you can go. Or can we continue as we have done for generations, fishing from the sea ice? All right. This is, well, I already said this in words, but it's part of this, what I was saying was, once you retreat the ice into this deep part, it's very hard to make it advance again. So I won't repeat that. It's just another version. You can read it if you want in the paper. All right, so climate narratives. So actually, I didn't introduce this project properly, but this project doesn't only involve natural scientists. It involves social scientists and artists. So it's a combination of humanities, the social sciences and natural sciences. And we call it climate narratives. And the idea is to use and to collaborate with the local knowledge holders and to learn from those narratives and stories and local understanding of change through generations. So the generational knowledge that the communities in this part of Greenland have, and not only in part of Greenland, but also in the communities in the islands of Fiji. And the reason is when, I already said this, the ice melt in Greenland impacts global sea level, mostly in the tropics. It turns out also when we started this project, talk to people in Greenland, talk to people in Fiji. People in Fiji live very close to nature. They're very strong and rich storytelling culture. There's a big community of fishing and tourism, exactly the same in Greenland. So it actually turns out there's so much that they have in common at the same time as, there's such a different environment. So just this exchange of knowledge, not only between communities and scientists, but between communities is fascinating to be part of. All right, that's a long story and I won't go into that. All right, and this is to remind me to say that, the halibut, which is pictured here, are fat, large ones. And the reason that they are so thriving in this deep fjord is because of this deep, what we call subglacial, this water that comes from the bottom of the glacier. This is the fjord and this is the icebergs, and brings with it a lot of nutrients up to the surface or to the shallower parts of the fjord. And this is also where you find a lot of fish, you find a lot of seal, you find a lot of whales, you find a lot of birds, and you find a lot of people who want to take advantage of this. When I was there a month ago, like I said, there were 10 fishing boats going in with us. I went there because we were going to put out a float. It's called an Argo float. It's a profiling float. It's a drifting instrument about, 1.5 meter high. We dropped it about here, and it goes up and down and sends every 3, 4, 5 days to satellite the information about the temperature and salinity in this fjord. And there's very little data. The only data we have here that's substantial is from seals, which have been mounted with instruments to do the same. And they go really deep. They can dive really deep. This is like a 500-meter deep fjord, in some areas even deeper. So it's very hard because of the icebergs to get in there. So it's the first time ever that's been an instrument like that deployed here. And I'm very nervous, and I'm checking every day almost to see, is there new data from these instruments? Because it's now under some of these icebergs. So we'll have to wait and see. Hopefully it'll surface at some point, and we might have to wait till next year to get the data when there's less period with less ice again. You never know. That's part of science. Okay, so what about the people of Kalaallit Nunaat, or the people of Ilulissat? And these are pictures from Iliana and Linda, who are two PhDs in this project. One is a marine biologist and one is an oceanographer. And they've been working for up to 4 or 5 months in a stretch in these communities of Disko Bay, and being integrated into the community, not only through science, because they depended on the local fishermen, which we paid to be part of the team when we go out and do measurements, but also socially in terms of taking part in all the cultural events, and even learned quite a bit of Greenlandic. Iliana here works on the zooplankton, the little or big phytoplankton, not phytoplankton, zooplankton or zooplankton. They eat phytoplankton, right? In the fjord, and Linda is working on the more physical changes in the fjord, temperature, salinity, and even oil spill from cruise ships, and how that impacts these type of ecosystems. So we need to have both. And what Iliana has found is, well, this zooplankton community is essential for a large part of the ecosystem in this Disko Bay and in the fjord, including the whales. And in her, these are preliminary results showing that you're having the change in species from these kind of blue-red ones to the yellow ones, from what used to be a cold species, Glacialis, of the zooplankton colonist species, to a warmer colonist Phenomycicus over the recent years. And what does that mean? Well, it turns out, and this is the physicist's description of something much more complicated, but these Glacialis cold water species of zooplankton are fat and juicy, and these Phenomycicus are sort of skinny and not as juicy and nutritious for the fish and whales and other species that live and thrive often seasonally in this fjord. So of course, that's the question we're asking now, is like, how does this, we know the temperatures in the fjord have been increasing. We know that these species of zooplankton have been changing. How does it affect the ecosystems and the marine mammals in this fjord? And there's just a few plots and pictures showing also what Linda is doing. And we have very limited, but starting to get longer time series. This is like a seasonal cycle of temperature. Like I said, it's not clear here, but it is getting warmer. You can see that the temperature is up to almost 4 degrees at depth in what we call the Atlantic water. So this is the water that's below the top layer. The top layer is very cold and very fresh, and a bit deeper down we find water that comes from offshore into this Disko Bay system. It's quite complicated, and it all's connected also to how much meltwater you have from the glacier, but long story. The water is important to understand how much is changing, and also how the circulation in this system is affecting the ecosystems. All right, so now we go to the people of Kalaallit Nunaat. So what I said already in the beginning, right? Normally scientists like me, we fly in and out. We have our pre-defined questions that we want to answer, right? I want to know why the ice is melting and how much it impacts sea level. I never thought of communicating, learning, interacting, understanding, and defining questions based on the community I work with. But through years working with several of these people on these pictures, you develop very close relationships, right? And you learn through just talking and stories that are being told about how things have changed and what are the concerns and what are the questions. You can already see on some of these pictures some of the questions that arise, right? More open water, a change in the way they do their fishing from dog sled to boats. The tourism is becoming a big thing. And actually, Bernard here is a good friend. He used to transport fish with snowmobiles back and forth, back and forth. Now they use piston bully. So it's not all negative. There's actually also some things that indicate that the fisheries have, well, expanded in the recent years. And also people have been able to buy bigger boats, and it's just changing the way they're doing they're practicing their fishing. Same time, it's a very, very traditional community in many ways, modern and tradition, but one of the main events, sporting events of the year, and this is something I've seen or been part of almost every year I've gone there. This is the kids dog sledding race. and the winner here from, I think it was from Ilulissat coming in. And you have almost 3,000 people out here as part of this. And you have to see the last part, that's the most exciting. But the nice thing is like such a vibrant community that it's also very welcoming. You feel part of it, and you're learning at the same time as being included in the group. So what I learned from Bernard, who transports the fish, is all these challenges that the fishermen are facing. For example, the change in the sea ice conditions, the change in the amount of icebergs, the stability of sea ice, the change in the shortening of the season, but also the amount of fish that they're transporting and the type of fish species that are coming in, which are essential for the biologists in the program. And the questions, and it could be questions, one was I told you already, the number of sea ice embedded, the icebergs embedded in sea ice and the shortening of the season. The other one was, well, there are all these now kind of snails in the summer last year that are with vinge snail in Norwegian, I don't know what they're called in English, that are shown to be all over the surface of this fjord. And it happens, it's not necessarily something unheard of. But the question was, why are they there now? Is it due to climate change? How will it affect the number of whales coming in there? Because the taste of the meat changes when you have this type of snails in the fjord, and they weren't too happy about that. But the question was, will there be more or less whales this season because of these snails in the surface ocean? And this is just a zoom out on the area where they do the fishing. So this is where they transfer from snowmobile to dog sleds and then go out. And you can see here some of the icebergs embedded, right? This is a kind of challenging environment to work in. So they're already at kind of pushing the limits of what's safe to do, but there's a lot of people out here every winter, and this is a big part of their way of life and important. The other thing with Ilulissat and with some of the stories and the people is Søren here told me about his upbringing, and it turns out he'd been to Norway as a youth when he was quite young. And I was trying to work out, and he had various stories about being in the winter in the snow and the trees of southern Norway outside Kongsberg skiing for a few weeks when he was a youth. And I was trying to work out why. And it turned out he'd been, as many Greenlanders, been removed from his family as a young kid to become Danish. So he was removed and placed in a Danish family to learn Danish and to be civilized. Fortunately, most, including Søren, were sent back to Greenland, and he was actually positive, but he only talked about the Norwegian experience, which was his vacation in the snow, not as much about the Danish kind of training or cultivating, or what shall we call it, that he went through. But there are also, of course, the stories that you might have heard about now of families where the kids never came back and were adopted without really the parents in Greenland knowing it. So this is something that's underlying here that I think is also important as scientists to understand, right? There's this colonial history between the Nordic countries and Greenland, or Denmark in particular, and Greenland, that's quite tough. Unfortunately, at least as a Norwegian, it's a bit easier to work in Greenland. People are very open, very, very welcoming and hospitable. It's a big advantage if you know the language, but all the young people now speak English. So this is not a problem, right? For all of you who speak English, it's very easy to work in Greenland with the younger generation. The older generation, you depend on Greenlandic and Danish. But of course, this history is something that we have to be aware of. And it's also finding some good people. Now, it's just a few words of advice is finding some person that you trust, that you know well, that you can relate to, and you can learn. How do you as a scientist approach people and relate to people? And you'll do mistakes. I've done all the mistakes in the book. As I told some of the students yesterday, I'm a very talkative person. I'll just ramble on. And if you're there in a conversation with someone from Greenland in particular, they will just be quiet, and you won't learn anything. They will never give you anything. They will just be quiet, right? Because it's not a good etiquette to interrupt. So to stand back and listen and to spend time and be patient is such a critical way to be part of and to be able to learn and be part of this community. So just keep that in mind. Okay, and then you've heard the statement probably. It's been very much in the media. And I don't remember who said it first, but it's been there for a while. But the most famous quote, maybe recent one that used this is Mutegede, he was the former prime minister of the self-government of Greenland. Nothing about us without us. And this is, of course, challenging, right? I'm a white Western scientist. Come into Greenland, what do I know? How do we relate to the communities there when we work with them? But there's a really nice and very helpful guidance that was published just a few years ago by the Greenland Research Foundation. And this is kind of essential guidance for us as international scientists, and maybe it makes, in this community at least, it's nothing new, but research must be anchored in Greenland, research must be support sustainable social development, and the research results must be easily accessible to all. That's actually very, very hard. And I've been struggling with this because we now have a lot of knowledge, a lot of data, a lot of joint knowledge with the communities that we've developed over the years. How do we make this practical and accessible and useful locally? There's the data must be handled according to the open science principles and research policy, all that. That's maybe not that hard, but to make it useful is much harder. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I just want to mention this, and this is kind of nice also. What it says here is the increased use of indigenous and local knowledge place a greater emphasis on how indigenous and local knowledge can be integrated on an equal footing into local and international research projects. Knowledge that has been passed down from generations to generations and is bound to cultural, spiritual, and linguistic values, right? So there's such a rich knowledge there through generations that we have the opportunity and the benefit now of being part of, learning of, but we have to do it in a respectful and mutually understanding way. What happens now, I told you already, there are about 1,000 scientists coming to Ilulissat. There are 5,000 people living there. Obviously, someone's going to ask the same question to the same person many times. And eventually they'll be, everybody will just, I'm tired of this. And this is what we call research fatigue. They won't be able to, we as scientists, tap into this or be part of that or engage and relate and collaborate because it's just overpowering to have so many the same place. I just added this because I think it's important given the political situation, right? Greenland, we're not for sale, but they're open for business. This is in Danish and Greenlandic, but Mutegede had some really strong and important statements over the past months during the election. Just hands off. We want to collaborate, but we are not for sale. We're Greenlanders. We don't want to be Americans. We don't want to be Danes, right? So yeah, that said, that's important. Keep that in mind. Okay, so what's our if not solution, what's our way of working with the community? So a few years ago, I had a meeting with the city council and with the museums, and we came up with the idea we should have a safe space, a house. It's a house bigger than this room, about 350 square meters in Islumut. It's the old part of Ilulissat. You can see the fjord there with the icebergs. It's an old shop, Yupi it was called. It was sort of where people hung out and drank beer. But now it's become a community space where everybody embraces it. Kids are running around and enjoying this space as well as adults. This is sort of this is where they dry fish and things. It's part of the local community with houses all around, and there's a local school just above it. It started as just a big warehouse, big open space. We had a workshop. So this is, I told you, collaboration between artists, scientists, and the artists came in with a few of their people who work with furniture, and together with the local arts and craft teacher at the school, they made all the furniture in this room. This is Christian, the local arts and craft teacher. His partner is actually the English teacher, so that was also fun. So they've been part of adopting this space, and this is Nils Christian, one of the other more professional carpenters who renovated the space. And Alana, who helped when we opened the space. We had a big workshop for everybody with mostly community members and also a large number of international scientists and artists part of this. So we had this space. It's more like you can come here. It's open the door rather than we go out and try to engage people outside. but it's more like a safe space where people can come and learn about science or contribute to the scientific practice, and also artistic events. So this is Maiken from Nuuk, who did the workshop on the geology of Greenland, so just bring a rock and I'll tell you the story of that rock. She also has a really cool concept of telling you where can you find gemstones in Greenland, so a recipe. You can ask her about it. And then we had Irene, who is one of the local artists who had a little artist community that started using this space to, both for display and also engaging. So we have a residency program so that we have Nunavut, Greenland, Sápmi, an Alaskan artist will get a stipend, or scientists can have a stipend to come and work there for up to a month at a time. And then also use it for not only workshop, but for exhibits. And these are some of the exhibits that we've had over the past. And then importantly also is the community. For example, the school had an activity here where they had the stories told by the school children about their perspectives of climate change and sustainability from the perspective of someone in Ilulissat. That was an incredible, really learning experience for all of us. And then it's more the elders, the one working with dog sledding as a profession, and I'm quite concerned, Jørgen, about not being able to recruit the new generations into this, because they're not that interested in see that there's a challenge in, with the sea ice and the snow conditions to be able to make a living with the traditional dog sledding. But he told us his story, and then we have Vera there, who told the story about the fabrics that they use for making their comics, some part of the traditional costume, that it's changing because of the dryness or the more humid weather, because of the more open conditions in the fjord and the bay. And then we have the more modern tourism. So there's of course, an issue. I told you there's a lot of cruise ships. There's also a lot of small, about 10 to 15, maybe even 20 now, small tourist companies. And they have a very short season in summer, but then all the cruise boats come in, and they're trying to sell their tours, the small companies on the fjord, and they have a lot of local knowledge to share. But then the big tour companies and cruise ships, they have their own boats, they have their own people who are not native to Greenland, are not living in Greenland, who they are competing with. And this is a big challenge. At the same time, it's a big opportunity for Greenland, right? Because they need to live off something. So fishing, tourism is really important. Mineral exploration, we're not going to talk about that, but that's another one. I can go on and on about, but one of the things we discussed, of course, was some of these issues and how to deal with it, both on the national and the local level. And then we've been asking over the years, what other things can we contribute with as scientists? And that gets you roped into something that maybe I never thought I would do as a scientist, but this is a ice music festival that we ended up having. So it's a science camp where we show them ice coring and talk about snow and how snow crystals go from snow to ice, and all of these things that are science-based at the same time as we have artists doing concerts for the families and the children and the local community, as well as tourists who come there in Ilulissat. So I'll just leave you with that one before and you probably won't hear the sound, but this is the, sorry, that wasn't, this is the sound of ice from Ilulissat. I'll stop it there. The two who are standing there are Nanook. It's a very popular local band from Nuuk, and the choir behind them from Ilulissat. All right, thank you.
Thank you. So we'll open this up for questions from the audience. I'm going to have two willing microphones. Thank you.
I can't answer anything, but try.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a really interesting talk and really incredible to see all the places that you've been in the research and community efforts that you've been doing. I guess one of the questions I have is, I think, so I'm a scientist, and I think about working with communities and trying to develop those science questions from the ground up, right? With including people who are living in these places, and also, me as a scientist. What are some of the interesting questions that have come out of those discussions? Like, what are people in, for example, Ilulissat, interested in knowing about, the Greenland ice sheet or climate change or things like that?
So thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions that I'll just mention a few of them, and they're really inspiring. And sometimes you just don't realize before afterwards. You have this conversation. It's like, oh, geez, that's relating to what we do as scientists, but it aligns surprisingly well with, because you can't help having some preconditioned questions that you want to answer as a scientist, right? But just the experience of learning and discussing and discovering some of the questions that they're important to them. I mean, one of the things that's the obvious one to me was working with the glacier more, is that they observed the change in the size of the icebergs. And I think, Ellen, if you agree, that we can answer that quite well. Like, why are they much bigger and more extensive, like tabular almost icebergs in the past, and much smaller now? And then that's something we can model to some extent and understand through the physical, when the ice retreats into the narrow, shallow part of the fjord. And then we can also predict that they will be larger when we're going forward in time. So that's a story they tell us. They've been, larger going 30 years back or 40, 50 years back, and then now they're much smaller. And then we can start discussing, well, we think they'll be larger in the coming century or 10, 50 years. What's the impact on that? And then we start talking, why is that important? Well, the fishermen who go into this fjord, they zigzag in between these big icebergs that are, half a kilometer thick, and you only see part of it above the surface of the ocean. When they break or turn, there are big tsunamis and waves, and just really big hazards. This last summer, there's one of the Navy ships actually almost got caught. They just got damaged, but nobody got injured. And everybody knows someone in the family who has lost someone crossing this fjord, because they go back and forth not only for fishing but for meeting family members or working on the other side of the fjord. So that's one for me. The other one is, they also told, just recently, I got that story last year, I think, of when the icebergs were much larger, you had this large wave tsunamis coming up along the coast outside the harbor, and you have the sieging. You sucked out a lot of the water from this bay where the fishing boats are parked. There are about 400 fishing boats there, and a lot of them were damaged. And I got actually a video of this from, I think it was, I don't remember how many years ago it was, in the 60s or even before, and it was really devastating, right? So of course the question is, when that period comes again and these big icebergs are there, if they're there, how do they design the harbor? What's the future? The other one is, of course, now we can give them the rate we're working on. I didn't show the pictures, the rate of uplift of the land, or the drop of the sea level. And it's really substantial, several tens of centimeters in the next 100 years. And they're designing a new harbor for the cruise ships. We need to take that into account. So then we start the dialogue. We were called in could have been asked. It was like a day where all the planners of the cities along the coast wanted to know specifically this, because they want to plan for their infrastructure. And then, of course, the geologists who are concerned about the avalanches or rock avalanches along these unstable fjords, because they had one a few years back, which was really bad, and people died. So, okay, that was more the icebergs. I mean, the other one was should we buy a boat because it's going to be harder to fish from the sea ice? Why is it more humid? Why does it feel colder even though the temperature is warmer? So Bodil actually wrote down in her book, every day the temperature, looked at the thermometer, was out in the cold in the morning and could really feel this. And she was very curious, why is this? So, of course, a lot of people know the answer, but at least this inspires the science. Yeah, that was just a few things.
So how does your work like help cultivate like local researchers and the local scientific community?
Yeah, or Iceland or Norway or US even. A lot of Greenlanders do their education abroad. They have to some extent. So yeah, this is a good question. I've done all the mistakes in the book, so I'm no hero here in any way. I mean, I've worked as an international scientist, only with international scientists for 10 years. Especially the ice coring project was no Greenlands. I was actually fighting in the last part of the project to get some of our colleagues on board from Greenland, but there weren't actually any scientists at that point that were interested in the ice coring. And that makes sense, right? Why is that relevant for someone working and living in Nuuk to work on an ice core from the top of the ice sheet? But then now it's the really keen thing that they're very interested in. We're working with Lawrence and Sasha. I don't know who works in Greenland here, but they're two of the scientists at the Natural Resource Institute in Nuuk. And of course, what they're doing is they're doing annual or summer, mostly field work in the fjord and looking at the seal populations and the ecosystem changes in the fjord, which is really important for the fisheries. It's also fishery management for the self-government to Greenland. So we're working together and have submitted several applications and have some projects together. So that's also now we're bringing 5 of the Greenlandic students from the SILA, the new program in marine biology, which is really exciting because they do not only the sort of traditional scientific studies that we do, they also have indigenous ways of learning in their program formally in Nuuk. It's in Greenlandic. So they're coming with us and we're learning as much and more maybe from them than we can contribute to their studies. But I think that interaction inspires our students, not the least, to learn about Greenland, to be mindful of Greenland and to do better science in Greenland in the future. At the same time, I think hopefully, we can bring some of our knowledge into the local science education and science collaborations in Greenland and help build the institutions. I've been poking NSF pretty hard to say that they need to step up their activities in the sense of community engagement and support in Greenland, because it has been hard sometimes to fund Greenlandic science and support science, and it's also controversial how to do this in the best and meaningful way. But that dialogue has to be. We need to have it, right? So I think I can't answer your question. I think it's really important that we are aware of this. And there was more on hands. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm deeply appreciative of the work that you're doing. And I think my question is sort of related to both questions that have previously been sort of mentioned and talked around. I'm originally from Nunavut, and I've grown up sort of listening to elders' stories and observations. And, in my mind, Inuit are some of the sort of penultimate climate scientists because they've thrived, since time immemorial in one of the most harsh climates that we know of on Earth. In Canada, at least, we've had this very complicated relationship with Inuit knowledge. About 10 or 15 years ago, for example, Zacharias Kunik produced a video, or a documentary, rather, sharing Inuit elders' stories, and maybe you're familiar about it, but essentially the elder observed that the horizon had shifted and was pointing to an issue at the North Pole, which then climate scientists listened to and realized that the pole had shifted.
Yeah.
And then sort of in another example, like that's sort of a positive way, another example, the Canadian government for a period of time closed the caribou hunt because they looked at the traditional migration of the caribou and they weren't there, and hundreds and thousands of caribou were missing. So they closed the hunt because they thought they were gone. They sort of blamed this was over hunting, exploitation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then when somebody finally asked the Inuit, the elder said, well, sometimes they go here and sometimes they go there.
Yeah.
And the Arctic is very big, and the Inuit said, well, look over there. And sure enough, there they were. And so then the hunt was sort of reopened after that realization that, what was sort of Euroscience was leaving a gap. It was leaving a critical gap in knowledge based on, the Inuits' historic understanding of the cycles and also of of those kinds of observations, because you have people that are everywhere. And so I guess all of that is a very long way to say, you started the conversation saying, you used to kind of be like, in Canada we call them snow geese. They like fly in, make a mess, leave.
Yeah.
You started that way, and that's not who you are now. But I wonder if you can explain a little bit more how you're working towards that parity in knowledge and understanding that Inuit science is science.
Yeah. I don't think I ever will be there completely, and I will never be able to fulfill that to the extent that I wish, right? But I feel that we're working together, and then we say Inuit knowledge is science, and that's definitely true. And we don't appreciate it. We don't have mechanisms to appreciate it. This is, brings in a question for me that I've been wondering, like, how do we acknowledge this collaborative effort that's put into these projects? Because we're working with fishermen who have incredible knowledge on the ground, you know this, right, or hunters. And we're benefiting so much in that collaborative sense. And of course, there are also scientists from Greenland involved. But like, and they're acknowledged in our kind of European frame of mind or in citations and whatnot. But how do we include those who are so essential for our science on the ground in our work? And that's hard. And to, we can compensate and we can facilitate and support the local communities with what they need as much as possible, but it's not the same. And we're never, kind of haven't found a good way of doing this. So I don't have an answer to that. I think at least for me, I felt that the easiest way for me to contribute, I'm a simple-minded person, right? I just flew in and flew out. Now I'm there for longer periods, and Susie, I shouldn't mention the name, but my family accepts it that I'm there for longer periods, which is critical. I made, to be able to really contribute, you need to be there long enough and to listen and learn, and then I think it's more a mutual, respectful and beneficial way of working, right? So it's at least at the personal level, I feel I've contributed to the community, and maybe never as much as I benefited, but it's more imbalanced than it was as a helicopter scientist. So I think though, I don't know how to answer your question, because it's really hard, but I think it's to be honest, to be open, and to listen, and to, of course, not believe that we're doing the best we can, but to learn by what other people are doing is a key thing. Open up doors for others who want to try, and we're allowed to fail, as long as you have a good person that you trust that can correct what you're doing, so that you don't end up in a very bad situation where everything kind of falls apart. I think that's the easiest way for me. And why we did the house, why we did the physical space, is because then it's people come in, they have an ownership, and then they feel at ease. We have no pictures allowed. You didn't see any pictures inside the house. And so it's a different way of working together than going out into community and expecting and demanding something as a scientist. Yeah. There's one more question. I know that it's over time, but
I can also hold it if we need to go.
You've had your hand for a long time.
And I was gonna say, let's just grab that one last question.
Sure,
and we'll wrap up.
So I really think it's so amazing, the ILU hub. I think that's such a cool idea, such an interesting way to connect to the community. And you also mentioned working in Fiji, and I don't know if that's something you're currently doing, but I wondered if you had anything similar going on in those communities, and if there are differences or like things you've learned from working in both places in the way they connect to science. Yeah,
it's a really good question. So in Fiji, in Suva, Fiji, they have an Oceania Center for the Arts, which has been really easy. And we have good people there who are local, who can and have infrastructure to take in science, take in art, take in the collaborative efforts. And we have people we can relate to. So it was a lot to learn, because they have the infrastructure and the checks and balances, ethical guidelines and restrictions also on how we work. In Greenland, it's been free for all. So we're trying to adopt the rules we have from these examples, for example, Fiji, and from even Norway, on how we ethically engage and how we document data and how we apply for permissions and stuff. We use what we have. They don't have it in Greenland. We use it from somewhere else. It's really good question. I mean, then that's something that I think in this community where you work with indigenous, in Nunavut or in Alaska, we have a lot to learn from each other. Ishlu means, by the way, igloo. I didn't mention that. Igloo as a house, but in Sami it means joy. So yeah, that stuck.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions, for joining us this evening. And if you can please join me again in thanking Dr. Nisancioglu for his wonderful presentation and for us all being a little more enlightened this evening. Thank you.